hear me now? If there, for some reason, the connection gets lost, then please, well, then you can't tell me, but we'll see how it goes. Hopefully this works out well. Okay, today I'm going to discuss how to obtain a residence permit for the arts industry. And this is basically what I will be talking about. I will first discuss the requirements for residency based on self-employment as an artist. I will discuss the application procedure, the costs, and at the end, I will focus on some special rules based on nationality. What I will focus on mainly today is the artist permit for non-EU nationals, because EU nationals and their family members have a different way to obtain legal residency in the Netherlands or continue their legal residency in the Netherlands after finishing your studies. So I will get to that at the end. So for now, I'm focusing on non-EU nationals wanting to obtain a self-employment artist visa. Okay, basically there are two requirements when you want an artist visa. One is that you have to provide evidence that your presence in the Netherlands serves an essential Dutch cultural interest. I will explain how that works in a second. And the second requirement is that you have to provide evidence that it's assumable that during the course of your permit, which will be valid for 2 years, you will be able to make sufficient profit through your company, so with your freelance activities. If those two criteria are met, you will get the permit for 2 years. There are a few other requirements, but those are the main two. Serving a Dutch cultural interest means that you need to provide evidence or confirmation letters of activities or projects in the Netherlands with Dutch cultural institutions or activities that are somehow funded by public money from the Ministry of Cultural Affairs. Basically, it means that if you have an assignment lined up with a Dutch cultural institution, for instance, a museum or a certain theater, or a certain a dance company, and they are considered a professional Dutch cultural institution, or they are somehow funded or subsidized by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, or not necessarily the institution itself, but the activity that you will be participating in is somehow subsidized by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, that is a project that can be seen as proof that your presence in the Netherlands serves a Dutch cultural interest. A question that I often get is, how do I know if the event that I'm going to participate in or the institution that I'm going to do the assignment for is, considered a cultural institution or is funded by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs? There's not a list online where you can find it. It basically means that you have to ask. You have to ask if that specific project is somehow funded or subsidized by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, or if the institution that you're going to participate or work for is somehow funded by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs or subsidized in any way. What you can think of sometimes if you're going to as an actor, or you're going to do a theater show, or you're somehow participating in a theater show, and the theater itself is not a professional cultural institution, but for instance, the theater is one of the locations of a theater festival, and that festival is somehow subsidized by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, it means that a letter from the theater festival or the theater itself is proof of, a project that serves a Dutch cultural interest. How do you prove it? As I said, you need a letter from that cultural institution or the institution that you're going to work for, where they specifically mention your name, so that it's you that's going to participate in a specific activity on a specific date, and what you're going to do for them. And preferably, they need to mention that they get subsidy from the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, or that they get subsidy from a cultural institution that is subsidized by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs. A lot of the cultural institutions that I often see letters from are aware of what kind of letter they need to provide and what the letter needs to contain. But it needs to be a letter confirming that you will be working or participating in that event that is set for a specific date or a specific period in time. A reference letter, for instance, a Dutch cultural institution saying, oh, we've worked with this and this person in the past, it went really well, and we have the intention to hire this person in the future, that is not sufficient. It's not specific enough. So it needs to be a specific project in the future. The second requirement is that you need to prove that it's likely that you will make enough gross profit. And I specifically mentioned gross profit, so that is your profit before taxes. How do you prove that? You need to get a certified accountant in the Netherlands to prepare a financial forecast for the next 2 years. And that forecast needs to show what your estimated gross profit for the future will be. The gross profit per year is roughly around 15,285 euros. It's a very specific amount, but what the IND looks at is they look at your gross profit during 1 year, one calendar year, so from the 1st of January till the 31st of December. They look at your gross profit over the entire year, and then they divide it by 12. And they look at that average monthly gross profit to see if for the last 11 out of 12 months during that calendar year, you met the income requirement. Because the income requirement is a monthly income requirement. And that currently is an average of 1,285 euros and 95 cents gross profit per month. And that amount is indexed every 6 months. So it changes every 1st of January and every 1st of July. On the IND website, www.ind.nl, and there is a search bar and you put in income, you get to a website where it mentions what the current average amount of gross profit you need to earn at that time is. The financial forecast, as I said, it's an estimation of what your income will be, what your gross profit will be for the next 2 years. That financial forecast is for 2 years and needs to be prepared by a certified accountant. That certified accountant will ask you for, your past income or the assignments that you have lined up, and that person will discuss with you what the basis for the financial forecast is. It doesn't mean that the IND doesn't look back to what your income was in the past for this permit. It's about the financial forecast for the future. So if you're only setting up your company now and you immediately apply for the artist permit, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you haven't had income as a self-employed person in the past. It's about the forecast for the future. The reason why I'm explaining this is because in 2 years' time, assuming you get the permit, and after 2 years you apply for an extension, which I will get to in a few minutes, the IND will look back to the previous 18 months to see if during those 18 months you ended up earning sufficient gross profit. So the applicable monthly gross profit. I will get back to that in a second. But for the application, it's not about what you earned in the past. It's about a forecast, an estimation of your future gross profit for the next 2 years. People that already have a company set up know that they have to, or most of them already have an accountant or a bookkeeper who does the taxes and all of that. If you have a bookkeeper, you can ask your bookkeeper to prepare that financial forecast for you. If you don't have a bookkeeper yet, feel free to contact me and I can refer you to someone that I work with a lot and who's very familiar with people that are applying for the artist visa and are in need of a financial forecast. So if you don't have someone yet, feel free to contact me and I can refer you to someone. So those are the two main components of the artist visa: a forecast of your financial or your gross profit, and assignments lined up for the future, proving that your presence in the Netherlands serves the Dutch cultural interest. One more thing I want to say about the financial part. The forecast, so the estimation of your future income, is not only based on the assignments that you have with Dutch cultural institutions. So if you are a photographer and you have exhibitions with Dutch cultural institutions, but to earn money, you also do private assignments. So you shoot portraits of lawyers for their website, for instance. You can't see me. I'm pointing at my colleagues, but you can't see it. So if you do that on the side to make extra money, that will be taken into account for your forecast, for your income. So the income that the IND will look at with the extension, but also the income that your accountant can take into account for the financial forecast, is not only based on your cultural assignments, but it's also based on private assignments, other work that you do as a freelancer through your company. So that's good to keep in mind. A third requirement is obviously that you have set up your company by registering it with the Chamber of Commerce. You can only set up your company with the Chamber of Commerce if you have a BSN number in the Netherlands, so your social security number, which can be obtained after you have registered yourself on a Dutch address with the municipality. So that is another requirement. You need to have or take out Dutch health insurance, and you can't be a threat to the Dutch public order. So if you have a very extensive criminal record, that can be a huge issue. So don't do anything stupid when you're studying in the Netherlands. Basically, that is what I want to advise you. How does the application procedure work? You need to apply for this permit as soon as it is likely to be successful. So that is even when you're still, you still have your study permit and you're graduating, or before or during your orientation year highly educated person, so your zoekjaarvergunning. Don't wait until the end of your zoekjaarvergunning, but apply as soon as you have assignments lined up for Dutch cultural institutions, because that is the main point of the whole application. So often I have artists coming to my office and say, oh, my search year will soon end and now I'm ready to apply for the artist visa. And I say, okay, do you have assignments lined up with Dutch cultural institutions? Yeah, I just finished 2. But I don't have anything yet for the future, but I will get some assignments. Then you're too late. You need to apply for this permit as soon as you have assignments lined up with Dutch cultural institutions for the future, because that is the main thing, the main part of your application. So that's why my first advice is apply as soon as the permit is likely to be successful. As soon as you have assignments lined up for the future with Dutch cultural institutions, file for this application. The processing time of the application is 4 to 9 months. And that sounds pretty long. 9 months is very long. But the reason why it can take very long is because whether or not your presence in the Netherlands serves a Dutch cultural interest is not determined by the Dutch immigration authorities. It is the Ministry of Cultural Affairs that decides whether or not your presence in the Netherlands serves a Dutch cultural interest. That means that when we file an application with the Dutch Immigration Authority, the IND is the Dutch Immigration Authority. So the IND looks at the application, and the only thing they do is they check if your forecast, so your financial forecast is in order, and if the application is complete. If the application is complete, they will forward the application to the Ministry of Cultural Affairs for advice. And that is advice about if the assignments you have with cultural institutions are sufficient to prove that your presence in the Netherlands serves a Dutch cultural interest. And the Ministry of Cultural Affairs has 6 months to issue that advice. In the past, they issued an advice within 2 months. Currently, it really takes up to 6 months. So that is 6 months for an advice, and the IND has 3 months to decide on the application. 3 and 6 makes 9, so it could take up to 9 months until you get a decision on your application. The great thing is that during your application, you have legal residency. So let's assume you have a search year permit, which is still valid for another month. You apply for the artist visa, and obviously pending your application, your search year permit expires. That's not a problem, because during the application for your artist visa, your legal residency in the Netherlands continues, and you're allowed to work as a freelancer, as a self-employed artist, awaiting the outcome of your application. So you can work and you can be in the Netherlands. Yeah. Once the Ministry of Cultural Affairs issues an advice and the advice is positive, the IND will decide positively on the application. If there is a negative advice from the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, the IND will decide negatively on the application. If the IND takes a negative decision, we have the option to appeal that decision, and that is 4 weeks' time. In 4 weeks, you have to file an appeal. Assuming that the outcome of the application is positive, the permit will be issued for 2 years, and that permit can then be extended for another 5 years. And then you can extend it again for 5 years, and then again for 5 years. But the first permit, the first artist visa, is issued for 2 years, and then it can be your extension will be issued for 5 years. Renew your permit in time. So don't start 2 days before the expiration date of your artist visa, but take from 3 months before the expiration date of your artist visa, you can apply for an extension. Use that time, because it can take another 3 months until the IND decides on your extension application. So, it's better to just apply for an extension 3 months in advance. As I explained, when you file an application for extension of your artist visa, the only thing that the IND will look at is your income. The IND will look back 18 months and check if during those 18 months, your average gross profit per month is met that income requirement that I just explained. So the 1,285 euros and 96 cents, I say by heart. If that is the case, the permit will be extended for 5 years. So with your renewal, so your extension application, the IND does not ask the Ministry of Cultural Affairs for advice again. You don't have to provide evidence of assignments with Dutch cultural institutions again. It's the extension permit is focused solely on income. Yeah. How much will it cost? Unfortunately, the IND filing fee is really high. It's 1,416 euros, which needs to be paid. You file the application, you will then get an invoice from the IND. You have to pay within 14 days. If you don't pay the filing fees, your application will not be processed. So it's quite a lot of money to file for this application. And that filing fee, this is the current filing fee, but it will be indexed every 1st of January. And normally it goes up by a few euros. Sometimes it goes down. It depends. Also, you need to keep in mind that you have to pay your bookkeeper or accountant for the forecast, the financial forecast. How much they charge, I cannot tell you. It really depends on the accountant. And also possibly lawyer's fees. If you want assistance during the application, that will cost as well. It really depends on your situation, how much it will cost you. But, it would be, say, roughly around 750 to 800 euros for assistance by a lawyer. In some cases, I do get a lot of questions from artists that say, okay, my search year permit has expired. I have a pending artist application, but I need to travel abroad. Can I do it? Yes, you can. If you either have a nationality that does not require a visa, a short stay visa. If you do have a nationality that normally requires a visa to get into the European Union, you need to obtain a return visa before you can travel outside the EU, which will cost you 161 euros. So that is something that you do need to keep in mind, that if you are waiting for the outcome of your artist visa application and you have to travel, it can be a tricky business and it can cost you money. So it's always good to call the IND to see if you need any additional visa when you want to travel while awaiting the outcome of your application, or contact a lawyer to discuss it and to see if that is needed or not. Special rules based on nationality. In the beginning, I already explained that if you have an EU nationality or a British nationality, or if you are a family member of an EU or British citizen, different rules might apply to you, because EU citizens have legal residency in the Netherlands if they work as in self-employment. They don't have to apply for a separate permit to do so. And that could also apply to their family members. And family members can be children, it can be parents, it can be unmarried partners, married partners, registered partners. So there are a lot of exceptions to the rule. So if you are an EU citizen or British citizen or a family member of an EU or British citizen, maybe it's not even necessary for you to apply for the self-employment artist permit, but there are different ways to continue your legal residency. If you have US nationality, Japanese nationality, or Bolivian nationality, also different rules apply. And the reason for that is that the Dutch government has friendship or trade agreements with the US, Japan, and Bolivia. And because of those trade agreements, it is fairly easy to obtain a self-employment permit in the Netherlands, because it basically means that you have to set up your own business and invest an amount of at least 4,500 euros into a company. If you do that, you can get legal residency for self-employment. It means that it's just an investment and setting up a company. You don't have to have assignments with cultural institutions. You don't have to have a financial forecast for the next 2 years. It's basically about investing money into your own company and then start working. You do need to apply for a permit when you're a US, Japanese, or Bolivian national, but different rules apply. If you are a Turkish national, it could also mean that different rules apply, because the European Union has an association treaty with Turkey. And on the basis of that association treaty, it is possible for Turkish nationals to apply for self-employment permits if they can prove that they have sufficient assignments in general, so not necessarily with cultural institutions, but have sufficient assignments with which it's likely that they can meet the income requirement in the next 2 years. It's not always easier for Turkish nationals to apply for the self-employment permit based on the association treaty. Sometimes it's easier to actually apply for the artist visa, but it really is dependent on your specific situation and the assignments that you have lined up. So if there are any Turkish nationals present at the moment, and you feel that it might be difficult for you to meet the requirements of the artist visa, feel free to contact me to discuss your options for self-employment under the association treaty, because then we can discuss what the best solution for you would be, which route to take. And the nice thing is, for Turkish nationals, the application fees are lower, because because of the association treaty. I'm not going to go into detail because it's way too complicated to explain why, but Turkish nationals do have a preferential status close to EU citizens in some cases. Yeah, basically that's what I wanted to tell you in general about applying for the artist visa, because these are the main requirements. And I do understand that there might be a lot of questions still and about what the assignment should look like, what kind of activities can be considered serving a Dutch cultural interest. So any questions are welcome. The sheets that I just presented to you, it's more general information, which cannot substitute individual case assessment. I do want to mention that because these are the general requirements. But it's always good to if you feel like you don't know whether your assignments would be sufficient to prove that your presence serves a Dutch cultural interest. We can always schedule a consultation meeting to discuss this further. I think that the idea is I'm going to end my presentation and then hopefully get back into the meeting so that you can actually see me now. Hopefully you can get to see me now. Start my video again. Hopefully you can see me now. I think that the whole idea right now is that if there are any questions, you're first going to discuss them in breakout rooms, if I'm correct. And I think that Margarita is going to arrange that. But if there are, I don't know if there are questions already that we want to discuss, or if we're just going to go into the breakout rooms and then discuss the questions there, and then you come back. Margarita, I can leave that up to you. What would be the best way forward?
Yeah, I think it's good if we stick with our structure. I do see some questions coming in, and I'm taking note of that. So we'll bring those in as well, but I think we're going to continue with our plan, which I'm going to explain a little bit. As Nikki mentioned, Nikki, thank you actually so much on behalf of all of us for this presentation. Also really clear. It's very, very appreciated. As you can see, there's also a nice group of people here. So it's really necessary information that is often difficult to get access to. So we really appreciate
it's not published anywhere, which is very difficult. Which is, still don't understand why they don't put it on their website, but they just don't. So,
yeah, that's a big question. I also wonder, we talk about like how also these systems are so elusive, and information is in all these different places, but it's not centralized. So it's really great also to have you, here to also kind of centralize it and present it in a way that's much more digestible than roaming through the IND website. But as Nikki had mentioned, we're going to split into breakout rooms. I'm just going to explain the idea a little bit, which is actually based on the importance of also learning like horizontally from one another, sharing our experiences together. And that's also the sort of foundation of DIWAN as well, which is also to kind of be open about these questions and to talk with one another about our experiences. And so we wanted to spend 15 minutes in breakout rooms where Hilda will actually just automatically assign you into breakout rooms. And then you'll be there together for 15 minutes. And that's also a time where you can talk amongst yourselves and also kind of centralize the questions that you want to bring forward, in addition to the ones that we already saw in the chat. And that's also nice if people have sort of similar cases or a similar question, you can group that together because we only have half an hour at the end for a Q&A. And so it also acts as a way for us to kind of centralize some of the questions. And for you all to also maybe talk a little bit about your own experiences when you're in these rooms together. So right now it's like, let's say we're going to do it 15 minutes. So we'll stick to our regular schedule, which is we'll be in the breakout rooms till 5 o'clock, and you'll get like a 60-second notification in the Zoom interface saying like the breakout rooms are now closing. Yeah, I think that's it. So please remember, again, I'm just going to remind people who maybe joined a little bit late, we are recording this session so that we can put Nikki's presentation, but also the Q&A period online. There were a lot of people who were working at the time, so they were not able to join. So we want to make this information public. So again, if you do have a question and you do not want to have your name attached to that question, please send it directly to Faye in the chat. You do that by opening the Zoom chat, and then you can either, there's a little pull down menu, you can either send your question to everybody, or you could send it specifically to one person. So you can send it to Faye, and then Faye will bring that question up during the Q&A period. So I'm going to pass it over to Hilda, who will sort of automatically separate you into breakout rooms, and then we'll meet back here again at 5 o'clock. Okay, great. So while some of you were in the breakout rooms, we were also talking to Nikki, and she would like to actually address first the questions that were in the chat, and then we can move on after to the different groups that were in each room. So Nikki, I'll kind of field the question to you from the chat, and then and I know two of them you already said they're very specific, but I'll start with ones that I think you will be able to address. So there was a question from Carl about whether the assignments that you should be given, whether it should be planned in the future after the date of expectation of the application being granted, or can those assignments be during the orientation year and processing time of the visa application?
Thank you for your question, Carl. It's a good question. The assignments need to be planned for the future, and by the future, I mean after you filed your application for the artist visa. Preferably, it doesn't have to be that the assignments are lined up for a year into the future, so after the expected granting of your application, but it needs to be in the future. I always try to say at least in the next month. Don't do it the day after you apply, but for the future, it means that during your application, those assignments will take place while your application is pending. I hope that is sufficient.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I see thumbs up.
There was also a second question from Carl, which I don't know if this is maybe too large of a question for you to tackle, but it's about how you appeal a negative decision, how that process works.
Yeah, in short, I can say that if you have a negative decision, it will mention that you have 4 weeks time to file an appeal. It will, in the decision, it is mentioned where you need to send your appeal to, and basically it is an appeal in writing. In that letter, you just say why you disagree with the decision and why you believe it's incorrect. That's what an appeal entails in short, and it has to be done in writing. You don't pay appeal fees to the IND. So it's not that you pay an additional amount. If there is a negative decision and you disagree, you can file an appeal in writing to the IND. And then a different official from the IND takes another look at your application and the arguments that you present, and then they decide whether or not there is reason to revoke the initial decision and grant you the permit. In short, that is what an appeal is about. But if you have a negative decision, my advice, unless it's something very clear, but contact an attorney and present the negative decision and discuss, how to go about it, what should be presented. Because a lot of times I've dealt with such an issue before, or at least I have a good idea how to go about it. So it's always good to at least schedule a consultation to discuss it, unless you feel that it's something easy you can quickly fix. For instance, if they say your financial prognosis is insufficient, then you can try and present a new one. I hope that is sufficient. Carl, can I get a thumbs up again? Hopefully, yay! Good.
And Nikki, just an extra clarification point, while the appeal is in process, are you still able to continue working and living in the Netherlands?
Normally, this is a very legal question, but the law states that an appeal has a suspensive effect. Basically, it means that it suspends the consequences of the negative decision, which means you go back to the same status as you were in during the application. So it means that your legal residency continues, and you should also be able to continue your self-employment activities. Unless your decision is, or your application is denied because you are a threat to the public order. Yeah, then you actually have to go to court to get a preliminary injunction to make sure that you're at least allowed to stay in the Netherlands. But normally, in these kind of situations, you're already in the Netherlands, you've had a residence permit before, you apply for the artist visa, and it's denied for some reason, then you are allowed to await the outcome of the appeal and continue your freelance activities in the meantime.
Great, thank you, Nikki. There was a question from Viola, which was more tied into the kinds of places that could write visas for you, and the kinds of places that you can be doing projects for, which are relevant for the visa application. And Viola was asking whether like printmaking studios or fine art laboratories could also be Dutch cultural institutions, or do they only accept places like the Jan van Eyck?
That is it's a difficult question to answer, because it really depends on the activity that you're going to do. As I said, private institutions that are not Dutch public professional cultural institutions can sometimes host events that are subsidized by culture money, or they are working for a Dutch cultural institution and they're working together on a project that is somehow subsidized. So it's difficult for me to say, okay, that organization, yes, that organization, no, because it doesn't necessarily have to be that it's the specific organization, but sometimes it's a private institution. So for instance, a private art gallery that is part of an art festival and is a host during that festival, when you are showing your work in that place, because it's part of that festival that is subsidized by cultural money from the Ministry of Cultural Affairs somehow, then suddenly that activity can be considered, proof as serving a Dutch cultural interest. Whereas if it's just a private art gallery where you show your work to sell it in a normal, without it being part of an art festival or an art fair, it will not be considered an assignment for a Dutch cultural institution. So it's difficult for me to say, okay, those specific situations, yes, those specific situations, no. Sometimes it is really difficult to make that distinction. And I've had cases where we've had printmaking studios or someone who catalogs collections for museums. And then initially the Ministry of Cultural Affairs said, no, that's not sufficient. And I managed to turn it around in an appeal because I had additional information that I managed to present in a way that it was accepted. So sometimes it can be a very gray area, which is difficult, unfortunately. We don't like gray areas. Well, I like gray areas because I can move around. But when you want to know whether or not your application will be successful, it's difficult to hear that there is a gray area.
Yeah, that's clear. So, yeah, because I think we had an event before we were talking about these questions, but more amongst ourselves. And then it seems like the kind of like safe bet, let's say, are like institutions, cultural institutions that are structurally funded by public money. And then after that, it starts getting into this gray zone.
Structural funding by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, yes, that's great. Incidental funding by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, also great. But sometimes it's not immediately clear that sometimes you think, oh, this should be a Dutch cultural institution. And then it turns out that they're considered more private. Let's say chamber choirs, for instance, some choirs are where you are a director or where you are a singer, then they're considered cultural institutions, but sometimes they're not. and the same goes for orchestra. So it's sometimes it's a fine line, and then we have to, you know, get in a little bit deeper and try dig a little bit deeper and find out whether or not we can make that construction where we can show that there is money. And sometimes we just don't know. Sometimes they say, okay, it looks like I assume this will be sufficient, but sometimes we just send in an application to get a reply from the Ministry of Cultural Affairs just to see how they, you know, what their take on it is. And then from there we can, you know, we can go further. Sometimes I've said, oh, this is going to be very tricky. And then there was a positive advice. And I've had cases where I thought, well, this shouldn't be a problem. And then suddenly said, no, because we stopped our funding, or it was just too incidental, or just, but mainly structural funding, yes. Incidental funding, yes, if it's a private organization, but part of an overall festival that is somehow funded, yes. But we can play around a little bit if we, you know, find leads.
There was a very specific question about the return visa, which for those who missed it was a visa that you could get while your application is in progress if you have to leave the country. And the question was whether this visa gets granted immediately during a visa appointment. So perhaps you have to leave the country if for some kind of emergency, or does it take longer for this visa to get granted?
Yeah, if you need a return visa, it depends whether or not you need a return visa. A return visa, if you Google on the IND website, it's actually really clear. Just go to the IND website and say return visa, and it explains when you need a return visa, which nationalities need a return visa. And it also depends, in some cases, you need to have a very special reason why you have to leave the country. But if you are just awaiting the outcome of your application and you say, okay, I have to travel to, let's say, Lebanon because I have an exposition there, so I need to be present. You schedule an appointment with the IND for a return visa. You go there, you explain when you have to go, and they issue you the visa in your passport. That's it.
Great. Thank you. So this is like another kind of a question about who can grant you assignments that are relevant for the visa, and whether assignments that are given to you by arts educational institutions like the Amsterdam, I don't know what AHK is actually. I thought it was Amsterdam Hogeschool, but that's well, anyways, the kind of category, because those are funded actually by a different body usually, and not by cultural funding.
Yeah, a lot of times if you have assignments lined up with educational institutions, I do include them because I always include them. But if it's solely with educational institutions, there is a big chance that the Ministry of Cultural Affairs says, no, this is more educational assignments rather than cultural inspired. But it also depends on the assignment that you're doing. If it's just teaching, yeah, then it's more you providing education. But if I've seen assignments where people are sort of included in a program for alumni, where they're working on more cultural assignments, or they work together with students to create a cultural assignment, and then it can be different. So it's not a big no, but it really depends on what you're doing. Oh. I'm still here.
Yes,
sorry.
You are. Thanks, Nikki.
My screen.
I'm going to merge two questions together, which I think has a lot to do with actually what needs to be stated in the visa a little in the like visa letters that you get from institutions that are asking you or hiring you for work, for example. One is about like if there's like a required or a minimal amount of time which activities should meet. So for example, if you're like playing one concert versus if you've been asked to do like a 3-month, I don't know, solo show, just giving like two different examples. Is there something that, is there a requirement around the amount of time? And there was also the question about whether the fees should be mentioned in the letter. from the
The fees
institution.
do not have to be mentioned in the letter. It's not needed for your serving a Dutch cultural interest. However, for the financial forecast, it might be nice if you know what you're going to earn with a certain assignment, because then your accountant can take it into account when preparing the forecast. But it's not necessary for it to be for the letter for the culture serving the Dutch cultural interest. And no, there is not a specific amount of time. And also a lot of questions. A lot of times I get the question, how many assignments do I need? And again, there's not a minimum amount of time. There's not a minimum amount of assignments, but it all has to do with the kind of work that you do, the kind of artist that you are, and the assignments that you have lined up. When you're a musician and you have a one-time gig, basically, where you're included, it could be that they say, well, then it's too marginal. I haven't seen that, because most of the times when it's about a musician, they have a few concerts lined up. Or if they're a remplaçant on one of the orchestra lists as a violin player, and they say, okay, we're going to hire you as, to step in for a few concerts, and it's about 3 or maybe 4. That's not a problem. If you have one exhibition lined up for a few days, that could also be sufficient. But sometimes people have 3, sometimes people have 1, sometimes people have 6. It's not a specific minimum or maximum, obviously. But it's also about the nature of the assignments.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you. There was a question about, you had mentioned like this sort of special cases, also like with Turkish nationality in relation to the Netherlands, but I don't know if that's something you can actually answer.
No, it's not something I can discuss now, because the question, I have all the questions in front of me, so I can read them. But Turkish nationality and how it can function while applying for the artist visa, send me an email. I don't know who asked the question, but send me an email if you have questions about, Turkish nationality and whether or not the artist visa is the way to go, or if you have other options for applying for legal residency. Because unfortunately, the Turkish Association Treaty is one of the most complex and scattered law and regulations that we have with regard to residency. It is, so it's difficult. So not something I should discuss here right now, because then people will leave because it's too complicated.
Unless they're really into these deep legal dives into these questions. So that was Mehmet. So you can email Nikki.
My email was in my presentation. If at the end, when we're done with the Q&A, I can put that last sheet up again so that you can write it down if you have it.
No, thank you. I actually also already took the email for the note, so I think I'll just send you an email about it, because it seems complicated. Okay.
Good. And I would think the same goes for you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not surprised. Anything with Turkey is always complicated, to be honest, at this point. But thank you so much.
I will put my email in the chat, by the way. Maybe that's a good idea.
Oh, yeah, that's also nice. People can copy it.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was a question about monthly profit, whether it's after costs and before tax. So whether it includes VAT of the costs after they're deducted from the costs that are made.
You need to discuss that with your bookkeeper or your accountant. I'm sorry, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a bookkeeper. When I get the financial prognosis or the annual accounts, when I need to check them for an extension, I really look at the gross profit that there is, and I just check the amount, and I check, does it make sense? And then I check the amount, and if I see that the amount is sufficient, I will use it. So how your bookkeeper or accountant will calculate your gross profit is something you should ask to the accountant. And I'm putting on the chat the website of Hannah Sohier. She's from Hannah Helps. I work with her a lot. She's an accountant. She's very familiar with the artist visa. And she's not too expensive, I've heard. So if you need someone to help you with your bookkeeping or need someone for your financial forecast, go to Hannah. And if she feels like you're struggling with your application or, you know, your information raises any questions, she comes to me, she contacts me, and we can discuss together. So, yeah.
Maybe that's a nice also extension into another question from Yara, which is about if you could maybe give people a sense of, for all these special cases that we've been discussing, if you can give people maybe like a spectrum or an average of how much your services would cost, just so people have a sense. I don't know if that maybe is quite difficult to do, but
it's sometimes it depends. I can give you an estimation, but it sometimes depends on your application and what you need help with. So it could be less, it could be more. But she's asking about setting up a meeting. Normally we charge a fixed fee for consultations. Normally it's 200 euros. If you are an artist, it's 150. Then we sit down for an hour and we discuss your entire situation. When I work on applications, normally I work against a fixed fee. It really depends, but as I said during the presentation, you should roughly expect between 750 and 800 euros. Sometimes I decide to work on the basis of my hourly rate. Sometimes we can, the fixed fee will be less because it's really also dependent on the situation, the work that needs to be done. But that is something to include. So on average, 750, 800, excluding VAT. And I do see another question from Yin, which sort of relates to the question that I answered before. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to answer it quickly, because Yin's asking if exhibitions that were done in the past are taken into account to the application, or will they only consider upcoming exhibitions? I always present a short portfolio about who you are as an artist, and if you've been involved in big exhibitions or really cool assignments, we include it in a resume. We put in your CV. But what the Ministry of Cultural Affairs will look at are confirmation of assignments from Dutch culture institutions for the future. So after your application is filed with the IND, if you present letters that for assignments that take place between filing the application and the IND sending it to the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, or the Ministry of Cultural Affairs taking a decision, that's not a problem. Even if it already passed, the Ministry of Cultural Affairs looks at the assignments and states, yes, this is serving a Dutch cultural interest, or no, this is not serving a Dutch cultural interest. Because obviously it would be very random if it's up to the Ministry of Cultural Affairs to decide when they're going to issue an advice, and that would have an effect on your assignments. So, yeah.
I'm gonna, before I move, there was some really good questions from Jana, but before I move into that, there was a question that came in anonymously, which Faye will bring in.
Yeah, hello. Somebody asked, how does the IND count the years for study and the zoekjaar when you're applying for a Dutch citizenship, and I guess in regards to also the artist visa?
It depends. For naturalization, so for becoming a Dutch citizen, your study years and your search years will be taken into account as long as they are uninterrupted. So as long as there are no gaps between your permits. When you apply for permanent residency, there are two types. There is a national one, and there is one based on an EU directive. For the one based on it, both of them are permanent residence permit for the Netherlands. It's just that the basis, the legal basis for it is different. One EU directive, one national law. The one that's based on national law looks at your all the years that you've had legal residency on the basis of a residence permit, as long as I said, those years are uninterrupted, so there are no gaps. So when you apply for permanent residency on the basis of Dutch law, at the moment you apply, you need to have had 5 years of uninterrupted stay on the basis of a residence permit, and the permit that you have at the moment you file the application needs to be non-temporary in nature. Temporary in nature are study and zoekjaar. So you cannot become a Dutch citizen or get permanent residency when you're on your zoekjaar or study permit. You have to switch to either highly skilled migrant or a partner permit or the artist visa, and then you can apply. And the EU directive one, and that's, I think, where the question comes from, for the EU directive one, to get to 5 years of uninterrupted legal residency, your study years will be taken into account for 50%, and your search year doesn't count at all. But it doesn't interrupt your legal stay. So let's say, this is a bit, but you've had 4 years of study, 1 year of zoekjaar, and then 2 years of artist visa. Then the 4 years of study count for 2. Your zoekjaar, it doesn't interrupt your stay, but it doesn't count to get to 5 years. So you're only at 4. But for the permanent residence permit or Dutch citizenship, you've had 7. That's the big difference. I hope that answers the question. It's a bit difficult, but if you have any questions about this, or if you want to check whether or not, which permanent residence permit you would qualify for, if you're ready, if you switch to a permit that is non-temporary in nature and you want to apply for permanent residency, it's one application, and the IND makes an assessment for both types of permanent residency. So they first check if you meet the EU directive one. If not, then they go and they check if you meet the national one.
Nikki, do you mind doing another 10 minutes, or do you, because I know we said we would go till 5:30, so I just want to check in with you. Not a problem. Okay, so we'll be strict.
My colleagues know that if they have to leave, can leave, but it's fine. Normally we do these type of questions in person, having a drink. They're boring this way. Next time in person, but it's fine. No, continue.
Yes, there was some questions that came out of one of the groups. One, maybe it's a bit complicated, but it's about how the Netherlands doesn't recognize Palestine as a state. So what would be recommendation for this specific case?
That really depends on what your current situation is, what type of travel document you have, but there are options. So shoot me an email.
There's a question about whether if your assignment that you've included in your visa application finishes while you're waiting for your visa, does it affect the decision of the visa?
So that is exactly what I said. The Ministry of Cultural Affairs looks at the assignments that are presented by the IND, but they don't necessarily look at when it's ended, because otherwise it would be dependent on when the Ministry of Cultural Affairs is ready to issue your advice, that you would have an impact on the outcome of your application, and that cannot happen. So it needs to be for the future when you file the application, and the Ministry of Cultural Affairs just looks at the content of the assignment and where you're doing the assignment.
Okay, great. And there's actually, I think this is a good question about whether a grant from public funds is considered an assignment, which would be an example like the Stimuleringsfonds has like a young talent grant, and yes. What impact does that have on your application?
I've actually I've worked with people who have had the Stimuleringsfonds or the Young Talent, the 3 package deal from AFK. Those type of grants are definitely considered because you need to be present here to do it, and you only get it if you're present. So that should work. With grants and subsidies specifically aimed to you, it really depends on the type of subsidy and where it comes from. Because if you get subsidy from if it's from the Ministry of Cultural Affairs for a cultural project, yes, it can work.
Great. There was a question that a few people had, which is that it seems like the conversations we're having now are kind of targeted at students who graduated in the Netherlands. But what if you are a freelance artist who is not in the Netherlands but wants to move here?
Yeah. The same applies. I mean, you still need to have assignments lined up with Dutch cultural institutions, and you need to present a financial forecast. The problem is setting up your business in the Netherlands, because you can only register your company with the Chamber of Commerce if you have a Dutch social security number, which can only be obtained once you've registered in the Netherlands. And registering in the Netherlands can only happen if you have a residence permit here or have filed an application. So that's a bit of a catch-22. It really, the way to go about it, it really depends on your nationality. Because if you have a nationality that the rule is, sorry, I should explain this differently. Normally, the rule is that you file an application if you don't have a residence permit yet. So you haven't lived in the Netherlands yet. You are outside of the EU and you want to you want to get a residence permit for self-employment. The main rule is you have to file it from your home country or where you are, await the outcome there, and only once it's approved, you can travel to the Netherlands. That obligation to await your outcome outside of the Netherlands is specific to everyone, or it's aimed at everyone, but sometimes there are exceptions, and certain nationalities are exempted from that obligation. If you have a nationality that has the obligation to await the outcome of your application outside of the Netherlands, there's a different way to go about it than when you have a nationality in which you're allowed to travel to the Netherlands and file your application here. So the requirements are the same, but the procedure is slightly different. And it really depends on your nationality and where you are currently staying, how to file that application. Because you actually then, if you have that obligation to await the outcome, you actually have to sort of file an application through the Dutch embassy. And yeah, it's a bit of a different story. But Rafi, because I thought it was your question, really depends on what your nationality is and where you're currently staying. And what if you are staying in a different EU country, then it depends on the permit that you have, whether or not you can file that application from the Netherlands, or if you have to file it, for instance, in your situation, Avantika, from Portugal. So again, maybe a consultation in that case is in order.
There was a question, Nikki, if you, let's say you have projects lined up and then they got canceled after the visa has been granted.
Mm-hmm. We've had a lot of those issues due to COVID-19. Obviously, yeah. A lot of people have had their applications approved because of assignments that were lined up for the future, and then all those assignments got canceled because of the COVID pandemic. It's not a problem. It's not that they're looking at your assignments. On the basis of that, the application is granted. If those assignments are canceled because that happens, it's not a problem. It's not like the IND is going to check again if you've actually done the assignment, or if it get canceled because of a certain reason, then it's fine. The only time the IND might actually further investigate is if they feel that you've been given assignments, letters of assignments, but that it was a fraud because there was never the intention that you were actually going to do the assignments. And if the IND feels that that is the case, then they can obviously investigate and look into it. But if you have had assignments lined up for concert or exhibitions, and due to COVID or due to, I don't know, a lack of funding, that it turned out that they're canceling your assignment, that can happen. But it's not a reason that they're going to cancel your permit, because then you've had the permit. Then it's up to you to prove that as a freelance artist, you're able to sustain yourself by generating sufficient profit. And then with the extension, they just look back for those 18 months to see if you've earned sufficient income.
Great, thank you, Nikki. There was a question from Avantika, which was about being self-employed and teaching classes. I'm guessing it's classes within a cultural institution. And then there's no letters from institutions funded by the Ministry of Culture. So then are you considered an entrepreneur or would you be considered self-employed? I'm not sure if those are seen as separate categories.
I think those are the same things, but I think it's whether or not it can fall under the artist visa or if it's a regular freelance application. If you're just teaching classes, most likely that will not be sufficient for the artist visa. But do need to keep in mind that getting a regular self-employment permit, so not the artist one, and not based on your nationality where there are special rules for investment, it is extremely difficult to get a permit. 98% is denied, and only in very specific circumstances you get it.
Okay.
And someone said, what was the name of the second option with permanent residency in which the studies count? That is the permanent residency that's based on Dutch national law.
Thank you, Nikki. There was a question from Diana about the zoekjaar visa, but I'm not sure if it's maybe too specific.
Let me quickly see.
Yeah, it's at the 524
You're on a zoekjaar
mark.
visa, you get accepted for a study program. Should I change the visa to student again? And does that mean that I can't get another zoekjaar again? The zoekjaar is dependent on you graduating. So if you've done a bachelor program, then do a zoekjaar, then start a master's program and graduate, you can get another zoekjaar.
Great. I'm just gonna, because there's a lot of questions in the chat. I'm gonna see if there's someone from a group who wanted to ask their question who has not asked it in the chat. Maybe you could raise your hand in the Zoom, and if not, then we go back to the chat for one more question. Okay, it seems like the groups were asking in the chat. That's what it feels like. A lot of questions are coming up there. Okay, it's a question about if your application gets rejected and you do not want to appeal the rejection, how quickly do you have to leave the country after that rejection?
4 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
28 days. You have 4 weeks to file an appeal. If you don't file an appeal, during that time, you have to leave. Unless, again, if your application is denied because you are a threat to the public order, then you have to leave within 24 hours. Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's such a dark way to end our question.
Yeah.
There was a question
don't do anything stupid.
There was a question from Manjot, but this is something that Nikki already answered, which is whether funding from cultural institutions like Mondrian funds count as profit. By profit, you mean income. Yes.
It's something your bookkeeper can answer, but most of the bookkeepers say, in my experience, that if you specifically receive funds or grants to do certain projects, that is considered to be income that can be taken into account. And Carl confirmed it already. Artist funds are taxable income. So
great. Thank you so much, Nikki. We are now past our time, and you answered really a lot of questions. For those of you who have special cases, Nikki shared her email, so you can get in touch with her and also have a consultation session for these more specific questions. And we're also going to share the recording of this as well, so you can look back at it as you're working on your application. Yes, thank you all of you for being here and also asking these questions. I think it's really important. And thank you so much, Nikki, for all your time today. This is it's really special that you are volunteering your time for us and sharing all of the knowledge that you have acquired all these years.
You're very welcome. It was nice meeting all of you. And yeah, feel free to shoot me an email in case you have any questions, and hopefully we'll get to meet in person sometime soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Oh,
thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Wel veel vragen inderdaad.
Ja, inderdaad.
Ja,
Ja, anders. Goodbye, guys. I'm gonna go as well.
Thank you, Nikki.
You're very welcome. If if you receive any other questions, you can always forward them to me.
Nikki, we were also thinking if we can transcribe some of the answers, like we can now save the chat and from the video recording, transcribe your answers. Is that okay for you?
I would like to see them because a lot of the times, as I said now, quite specifically, I said a few times, it's a gray area. It really depends on the case. Because as I said, I explained to Fabi when I spoke to her, because I said I'm okay with recording because then you get the context of everything. But when things are put in writing, I always make I said it on the end of my presentation again, this is general information. It can never substitute individual case assessment because I have to be very careful with what is put in writing and is published as in my name, because if I somehow do that way, things get interpreted incorrectly, I can be liable for what I do. So it's for me, it's a bit of a slippery slope.
So in the sense that if we transcribe it, you prefer to review it before, or you prefer that we do not transcribe it anyway?
I would prefer not to have it transcribed, to be honest, because it's already in the recording. So I'd rather have people, go through the recording and listen to what I've said rather than having it transcribed. If you really feel like there are some, if there are a few things that you see that have come up and you decide, we would like to provide that information, then run it by me first. I can check it. I can and then we can use it.
Yeah, for example, like from the presentation itself, like those were pre-prepared, clear, like from the presentation that you gave, for example.
But if there were questions, that came up a few times and you feel like, okay, maybe we should add it, that's fine, but I would like to see it first. And also the format in which you present it, that it's, because I need to be aware of what is sort of written down and published indirectly, but in my name.
Of course,
if that makes sense. It's just that I'm liable for the information that I provide, and otherwise I can get fined or by the Committee for Attorneys. Yeah, it sounds really strange, but it's a very old-fashioned profession. They're very on top of you, so I do need to be aware of that. So we'll see. But yeah, if you feel like you want to put things in writing next to the recording of the presentation, I would really appreciate it if you could just run it by me.
Right, that's clear. All right.
Cool. If you have any future events like this, or if you're hosting, get-togethers where there are people from different fields, sharing their experience or something like that, feel free to always invite me. I can come by and chat to people.
We'll definitely invite you again. We already have ideas about having some kind of intersectional event where we have different specialists, because as you saw, the questions are also forwarded to accountants. It's like really intersectional.
Yeah.
So we will definitely.
And again, Hannah, she's very experienced in these applications.
Can you share, actually, I'll send you an email. Maybe you could share her details with me.
Yeah, I did share her website, so you can hannahhelps.com. I shared it in the chat, but I can also email to you.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll find it in the chat, and Maxime will email you if I don't find it. But we will definitely be in touch.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah. She's also really good.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Okay. Have a good evening, everyone.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Bye.